The situation unfolding in West Asia is not a routine diplomatic dispute between two nations. It is something far deeper and far more consequential. What we are witnessing is a structural confrontation between a declining global power, still relying on traditional coercive tools, and a state that has spent more than 4 decades under pressure, learning how to absorb shock, adapt, and respond with precision rather than collapse. The central question being debated in Washington is whether Iran can finally be broken. But outside Washington, in Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and even in capitals dependent on stable energy flows, the question is different. Has the United States misjudged the true cost of forcing this confrontation to its limit? Much of what is being reported in Western media presents a simplified narrative of pressure and response, but the reality is far more complex. The gap between public messaging and strategic reality is widening, and it becomes essential to examine what is actually happening beneath the surface, rather than accepting the headlines at face value. At the center of this crisis is the naval blockade declared by the United States. U.S. Central Command has announced that it has intercepted or redirected multiple vessels attempting to move Iranian oil, presenting these actions as evidence of successful enforcement. According to their figures, dozens of tankers carrying tens of millions of barrels of oil, worth billions of dollars, have been stopped or turned away. On the surface, this appears to be a demonstration of overwhelming control over maritime trade routes and a validation of the maximum pressure strategy. But these numbers, when examined more carefully, tell a more complicated story. The fact that such a large volume of Iranian oil was moving through international waters in the first place reveals something critical. Despite years of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and economic pressure, Iran had already developed functioning export channels capable of generating significant revenue. The blockade did not expose Iranian weakness. Instead, it exposed the limits of previous American strategies, which had failed to fully suppress Iranian oil exports. What we are seeing now is not the sudden emergence of Iranian vulnerability, but rather an escalation driven by the realization that earlier forms of economic pressure were insufficient. Iran had adapted, it had found buyers, established alternative shipping routes, and built financial mechanisms designed to operate outside direct Western control. The current blockade is therefore less a sign of dominance and more a sign that Washington has been forced to escalate because softer tools did not achieve their intended effect. This escalation, however, has triggered immediate global consequences. Oil markets reacted sharply, with prices rising rapidly and reaching levels not seen since earlier global energy shocks. Analysts across energy markets have noted that further increases are likely if the confrontation continues. Iranian officials have also openly suggested that prices could climb significantly higher if disruptions persist. These are not isolated political statements, but reflections of how tightly global energy stability is now tied to this single geopolitical flashpoint. The core issue becomes clear when examining the logic behind the blockade itself. The intention is to create economic pressure so severe that Iran is forced to accept diplomatic concessions, particularly regarding its nuclear program. However, the mechanism through which this pressure operates is global, not isolated. Oil markets do not selectively punish one country. Any disruption to supply affects all import-dependent economies simultaneously, including allies of the United States and even its own domestic consumers. This creates a structural contradiction. The more pressure applied to Iran through energy restrictions, the more instability is introduced into the global system. In effect, the tool designed to isolate Iran also generates widespread economic consequences that extend far beyond the intended target. American officials have argued that Iran's position near the Strait of Hormuz gives it disproportionate leverage over global energy flows. From their perspective, this constitutes a form of coercion. But geographically, this is not a constructed advantage. It is an inherent reality. A significant portion of the world's oil supply must pass through a narrow maritime corridor adjacent to Iranian territory. This fact does not change based on political decisions. It becomes strategically relevant only when tensions escalate to the point where access to that corridor is threatened. At the same time, discussions within the United States have revealed something even more significant. Reports indicate that military options, including targeted strikes and special operations missions, have been considered as part of contingency planning. These options range from direct strikes on Iranian infrastructure to highly sensitive proposals involving attempts to seize nuclear-related materials. The existence of such discussions is itself revealing. It indicates that after decades of sanctions, cyber operations, targeted killings, and diplomatic isolation, Iran has not been brought to strategic submission. Instead, it has maintained its core capabilities and continued its nuclear development within a framework it defines as sovereign. This has led planners in Washington to consider options that would previously have been viewed as extreme or unlikely. What makes these contingency discussions particularly significant is not just their content, but what they reveal about the trajectory of the entire confrontation. When a superpower begins seriously evaluating direct military action and special operations missions inside another sovereign state, it is usually because earlier layers of pressure have failed to produce the desired strategic shift. In this case, those earlier layers have been extensive: long-term sanctions, financial isolation, targeted strikes on allied groups, cyber operations, and a sustained campaign of diplomatic pressure spanning multiple administrations. Yet despite all of this, Iran's core strategic posture has remained intact. Its nuclear program has not been eliminated. Its regional alliances, though pressured, have not collapsed. Its military infrastructure, while damaged in specific incidents, continues to function. This is the context in which more aggressive operational ideas begin to enter formal planning discussions, not as abstract speculation, but as possible responses to what is perceived as strategic stagnation. However, there is another dimension that complicates the assumption that escalation will produce clarity or compliance. Global energy markets have already responded in a way that reflects heightened risk. The sharp rise in oil prices following the announcement of the blockade is not simply a reaction to news headlines. It is a reflection of how markets interpret the stability of supply chains under conditions of geopolitical stress. Traders are not reacting to rhetoric, but to the real possibility of disrupted flows through one of the most critical energy corridors in the world. This reaction exposes a fundamental tension in the strategy being pursued. The intention is to increase pressure on Iran while maintaining control over broader regional stability. But in practice, those two objectives are increasingly in conflict. Every step designed to tighten economic constraints on Iran introduces volatility into global markets that cannot be contained within national boundaries. The system is interconnected in a way that makes localized pressure extremely difficult to isolate. Iranian officials have responded to this environment with a mixture of caution and strategic clarity. Public statements from senior diplomats emphasize a consistent position. War is not viewed as a solution, but negotiation is only meaningful if it does not require surrender. This distinction is critical. From Tehran's perspective, there is a clear difference between diplomatic compromise and unilateral disarmament under coercion. The latter is seen not as negotiation, but as enforced capitulation, and it is precisely this framing that has remained unchanged across decades of pressure. Western commentary often interprets this stance as rigidity, but within the logic of state survival, it is better understood as consistency. Iran has repeatedly demonstrated that it will engage in dialogue, but it will not accept frameworks that eliminate its strategic deterrence while external threats remain active. This pattern has held across multiple negotiation cycles, including periods of intense diplomatic engagement. Former military analysts have added another layer to this assessment. Some have pointed out that additional rounds of strikes or limited military action are unlikely to fundamentally alter Iran's behavior. Instead, they are more likely to expand the scope of retaliation across a wider regional theater. Iran's strategic doctrine, as observed over time, tends to avoid symmetrical responses and instead focuses on creating pressure points across multiple domains, including maritime routes, allied infrastructure, and regional partnerships. This creates a feedback loop that complicates escalation management. Each attempt to apply pressure generates potential countermoves that extend beyond the immediate point of conflict. As a result, the system becomes less predictable, not more controlled. At the same time, external powers are not passive observers. Russia's involvement in diplomatic discussions reflects a broader awareness that this confrontation is not isolated. Moscow's public warnings against military escalation are not simply expressions of alignment with Iran, but also reflections of concern about systemic instability in global energy and security frameworks. Even in the midst of its own ongoing conflict dynamics elsewhere, Russia has positioned itself as a potential intermediary in nuclear-related negotiations, signaling that it sees value in preventing uncontrolled escalation. This is further reinforced by China's indirect but structurally significant role. As a major importer of Iranian energy, China's economic interests are directly affected by any disruption in supply chains linked to the Strait of Hormuz. Over time, this has contributed to the development of alternative trade mechanisms designed to reduce exposure to Western-controlled financial systems. These adjustments are not reactions to a single crisis, but part of a broader, long-term shift toward diversification of global economic infrastructure. What emerges from this layer of analysis is a picture of increasing structural complexity. The confrontation is no longer bilateral in any meaningful sense. It now involves overlapping interests from multiple major powers, each with distinct motivations, risk thresholds, and strategic calculations. And as this complexity increases, the likelihood of a simple, linear resolution decreases. As the confrontation expands beyond a purely bilateral framework, the original assumptions that shaped this crisis begin to weaken further. What was once framed as a direct pressure campaign between two adversaries is now embedded in a wider global system, where multiple powers, markets, and regional actors are responding simultaneously, each according to their own interests, rather than a single coordinated narrative. This is where the strategic environment becomes more difficult to control. In classical coercive diplomacy, one side applies pressure while expecting a relatively predictable reaction from the other. But in this case, the reaction is not contained within Iran alone. It spreads outward through energy markets, alliance networks, shipping routes, and financial systems that are already deeply interdependent. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of this dynamic. It is not simply a geographic choke point, it is a structural dependency built into the global economy. A significant portion of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through this narrow passage. Iran's position along its northern edge gives it influence not because of political rhetoric, but because of physical geography that cannot be negotiated away. This is why even the perception of instability in the region immediately affects global pricing. Markets do not wait for confirmed disruption. They price in risk in advance. That is why oil prices surged sharply following the escalation of naval enforcement measures. The movement toward higher price levels reflects not only current supply conditions, but anticipated future uncertainty. Within this environment, statements from Iranian leadership take on additional significance. When Iranian officials suggest that oil prices could climb even higher, they are not simply making political predictions. They are describing a structural sensitivity within the global energy system. At higher price thresholds, the economic burden shifts from being a regional issue to a global one, affecting industrial output, transportation costs, inflation levels, and political stability in energy-importing countries. This is where the strategy of pressure begins to produce unintended feedback effects. The more aggressively economic restrictions are enforced, the more global markets adjust in ways that dilute the intended impact. Instead of isolating Iran alone, the system distributes the consequences across multiple economies, some of which are allies of the very power enforcing the restrictions. At the same time, internal discussions within the United States reveal an important shift in strategic thinking. The consideration of military options, ranging from targeted strikes to special operations missions, reflects a recognition that economic pressure alone has not achieved decisive results. However, the move from economic pressure to military contingency planning introduces a new layer of risk that is far more difficult to contain. Military action in this context is not a localized event. Any strike on Iranian infrastructure or territorial assets would likely trigger a response that extends beyond the immediate site of engagement. Iranian strategic doctrine, shaped over decades of confrontation, has consistently emphasized asymmetric responses. Rather than matching force directly, it tends to expand the operational space of conflict, potentially involving maritime disruption, regional proxy activation, or pressure on allied infrastructure. This creates a situation where escalation becomes difficult to calibrate. Each step taken to increase pressure introduces new variables that cannot be fully controlled once activated. The result is not a linear path toward resolution, but a widening field of possible outcomes, many of which carry significant uncertainty. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels have not been fully closed, but they operate under increasingly constrained conditions. Iranian messaging continues to emphasize openness to negotiation, but within clearly defined boundaries. The central condition remains unchanged. Engagement is possible, but not under terms that require strategic surrender. This position is not new, nor is it a temporary stance. It reflects a long-standing assessment of survival strategy within the Iranian state structure. From this perspective, negotiations are not rejected, they are reframed. The distinction between compromise and capitulation becomes the core issue. Without recognition of this distinction, diplomatic efforts risk becoming exercises in repetition rather than resolution. External actors are fully aware of this tension. Russia's involvement in discussions around potential nuclear arrangements reflects a recognition that the current structure of confrontation is unsustainable if left unmanaged. By offering to play a role in overseeing enrichment arrangements, Moscow is positioning itself as a potential stabilizing intermediary, not necessarily because of alignment with any one side, but because uncontrolled escalation carries risks that extend beyond regional boundaries. China's position reinforces this dynamic in a different way. Its energy dependence on Iranian exports makes it structurally sensitive to any disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. As a result, it has invested heavily in alternative financial and logistical systems designed to reduce exposure to Western enforcement mechanisms. This includes diversified payment channels and long-term energy agreements that bypass traditional Western-controlled infrastructure. These developments are not isolated reactions. They are part of a broader pattern in which multiple major economies are gradually adjusting to a more fragmented global system. The confrontation over Iran accelerates this process by introducing uncertainty into one of the world's most critical energy corridors. As this fragmentation continues, the original strategic objective of applying pressure to achieve compliance becomes increasingly difficult to isolate from its wider consequences. What begins as a targeted campaign against one state gradually evolves into a systemic stress test for the global order itself. And at this stage, the question is no longer only about Iran's response, but about the capacity of the broader international system to absorb continued escalation without destabilizing itself. As the confrontation deepens, the limits of traditional pressure-based strategies become more visible. What was initially designed as a controlled escalation to achieve specific policy outcomes is now operating inside a far more complex global environment where every action produces secondary and tertiary effects that extend well beyond the original target. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is the behavior of global energy markets. Oil pricing is no longer responding solely to supply and demand fundamentals in a narrow sense. Instead, it is increasingly shaped by perceived geopolitical risk, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz. This means that even without physical disruption, the expectation of potential instability is enough to influence global pricing structures. This dynamic introduces a feedback loop that complicates strategic planning. When prices rise sharply, the economic consequences are distributed globally. Import-dependent economies experience inflationary pressure, transportation costs increase, and industrial output is affected. These effects are not confined to adversaries. They also impact allies and neutral states. As a result, the pressure mechanism begins to lose its selectivity. Within this environment, Iran's position remains structurally significant. Its geographical placement along a critical energy corridor gives it leverage that is not easily neutralized through sanctions or diplomatic isolation. This is not a result of policy choices alone, but of enduring physical geography combined with decades of adaptation under pressure. Iran's strategic behavior reflects this reality. Rather than seeking direct confrontation, it has consistently developed asymmetric tools of influence designed to operate across multiple domains. These include maritime capabilities, regional partnerships, and a network of allied or aligned groups across different theaters. The purpose of this structure is not necessarily to initiate conflict, but to ensure that any escalation against Iran carries broader consequences for the initiating side. This creates a situation where deterrence is not based on symmetrical military strength, but on the ability to distribute risk across a wider operational field. In such a system, escalation becomes inherently more complex, because each additional step increases the number of potential response channels. At the same time, Internal discussions within the United States reflect an awareness that economic tools alone have reached diminishing returns. The consideration of military options, including targeted strikes and special operations scenarios, suggests a recognition that the existing strategy has not produced decisive results. However, moving from economic pressure to kinetic action introduces a fundamentally different category of risk. Military escalation, in this context, is not isolated. It interacts with regional alliances, energy infrastructure, and global financial systems in ways that are difficult to predict or contain. Any direct action against Iranian territory or strategic assets would likely trigger responses that extend beyond immediate military objectives. This could involve pressure on maritime traffic, regional bases, or allied infrastructure, creating a wider zone of instability. What makes this particularly sensitive is that all major actors involved are operating under different strategic assumptions. For the United States, the objective is often framed in terms of preventing nuclear escalation and maintaining regional stability. For Iran, the primary concern is strategic survival under sustained external pressure. For external powers like Russia and China, the focus is on preventing systemic disruption that could destabilize energy markets and global economic flows. These overlapping but not identical objectives make coordination difficult and miscalculation more likely. Even when actors are not seeking escalation, the interaction of their strategies can produce outcomes that none of them intended. Diplomatically, there is still movement, but it is constrained by these structural realities. Iranian officials continue to emphasize willingness to engage in dialogue, but only within parameters that preserve strategic autonomy. This means that negotiation is not rejected outright, but it is bounded by conditions that exclude unilateral disarmament or acceptance of externally imposed strategic limitations. From Iran's perspective, this position is consistent with long-standing behavior under pressure. Across multiple decades and different negotiation frameworks, the central principle has remained stable. Engagement is possible, but not under conditions that fundamentally undermine sovereignty or deterrence capability. External observers have interpreted this stance in different ways. Some view it as inflexibility, while others see it as predictable behavior for a state operating under sustained external pressure. Regardless of interpretation, the practical effect is that negotiations remain possible, but structurally constrained. Meanwhile, the involvement of external powers continues to shape the broader strategic environment. Russia's willingness to engage in discussions about nuclear oversight mechanisms reflects an interest in preventing uncontrolled escalation, while also positioning itself as a relevant actor in future security arrangements. China's indirect but structurally important role in sustaining energy flows from Iran adds another layer of complexity, particularly as it continues to develop alternative systems to reduce exposure to Western-controlled financial mechanisms. Together, these developments suggest that the confrontation is no longer confined to a single bilateral axis. It has become embedded in a wider transformation of global economic and strategic architecture, where multiple actors are adjusting their behavior in response to perceived instability in core systems. As a result, the original logic of pressure leading to predictable compliance becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Instead, what emerges is a more fragmented and less predictable environment, where each action reverberates across multiple interconnected systems. As this fragmented environment continues to evolve, the strategic assumptions that originally underpinned the confrontation are becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. What was once framed as a linear process of pressure leading to compliance now resembles a complex system of interacting forces, where each move generates reactions across multiple domains at once. One of the most significant developments in this phase is the way energy markets are now functioning as an independent actor within the crisis. Oil prices are no longer simply responding to supply constraints or production decisions. Instead, they are reacting to perceived geopolitical instability, particularly around maritime chokepoints like the Strait of Hormuz. This means that even without direct disruption, the mere possibility of escalation is enough to reshape global pricing behavior. This creates a situation where economic consequences cannot be neatly separated from strategic actions. A naval blockade intended to restrict Iranian exports does not only affect Iran, it also feeds directly into global price volatility. That volatility then feeds back into political decision-making in energy-importing countries, many of which are not directly involved in the confrontation but are still deeply affected by its outcomes.